Lydia Carpenter never thought her quiet life by the lake would turn into a battle. But when the HOA claimed her beloved dock and arrived with trucks to take it, she uncovered a scheme so calculated it threatened not just her property, but the peace of the entire waterfront community. Lydia Carpenter had always believed the lake would be her forever place. For more than 20 years, the water had been her daily backdrop, changing moods with the weather but always steady, always hers. Her dock, a narrow strip of sun-bleached wood stretching a few feet into the water, was more than just planks and nails. It was the stage for family memories, a resting place for quiet mornings with coffee, and the perfect perch to watch the orange and gold of sunsets settle across the ripples. She'd painted the posts herself, repaired boards when storms passed through, and tied up boats there for years without a single question from anyone. It felt untouchable, as much a part of her life as the walls of her home. On a breezy spring morning, while robins hopped in the grass and the scent of damp earth lingered from the night's rain, Lydia opened her mailbox. Tucked between a grocery flyer and an electric bill was a cream-colored envelope stamped with the HOAS seal. At first, she didn't think much of it. Letters from the association were usually reminders about neighborhood meetings or seasonal lawn care tips, but this one felt heavier. She tore it open casually, expecting nothing unusual, only for her eyes to land on a set of sharp, printed words that made her heart slow in her chest. The letter stated that her dock was encroaching upon community waterfront property and was in violation of the HOA's regulations. It ordered her to remove the structure within 30 days or surrender it for use by the association. The language was firm, impersonal, and gave no room for debate. She'd read it again, certain she'd misunderstood, but the more she scanned the lines, the more it became clear. They weren't asking. They were telling. She set the letter down on her kitchen table and stood there in silence, staring out the window toward the water. From this angle, she could just see the end of the dock where the morning sun glinted off the wet wood. It was absurd. No one had ever suggested it wasn't hers. The dock had been there before she bought the house. The previous owner had even listed it in the sale. She still had the paperwork. This couldn't be real. There had to be some mistake. But the tone of the letter didn't sound like the opening to a friendly conversation. It sounded like the closing statement to a decision that had already been made. Her mind flickered through every interaction she'd had with the HOA over the years, the occasional newsletter, the yearly dues, the blandly polite greetings at the market. There had never been conflict, never even a sign of tension. So why now? She sat down and read the notice again, slower this time, taking in every word. It wasn't just about removing the dock, it was about handing it over. If she agreed to their request, the HOA could take her dock, claim it as their own, and use it however they pleased. That was the most unsettling part. It wasn't about aesthetics or safety. It was about control. Her hands felt cold against the paper. She tried to imagine the lake without the dock, but the picture in her mind looked incomplete, like a painting with its focal point erased. The idea of strangers using it as if it were theirs, standing where her children once fished or where she'd watched the seasons change, made her stomach twist. The letter offered no phone number for questions, only a post office box for written compliance confirmation. It was so formal, so deliberately distant, as if they had already anticipated pushback and wanted to keep her at arm's length. Lydia slid the letter back into its envelope and placed it in a drawer, though the weight of it seemed to follow her everywhere she went in the house. The sun was high by the time she stepped outside again, but the lake looked different now. Gentle waves and the distant call of loons didn't soothe her like they usually did. The dock still stood there, unchanged, but the sight of it now felt fragile, as if an invisible clock had started ticking the moment she opened that envelope. And somewhere deep down she knew this was only the first move in something far larger than she could yet see. In the days that followed, the letter refused to leave Lydia's mind, even when she tried to distract herself with housework or errands. In town, her thoughts always circled back to it. She told herself she had time. 30 days was a long stretch, but the unease settled in quickly. It wasn't long before she began noticing things she hadn't seen before, or maybe things that had only just begun happening. It started with the cars. On a quiet weekday afternoon, she saw a silver SUV idling across the street, facing her driveway. Its windows were tinted too dark to see inside. It sat there for 10 minutes before pulling away without a sound. 2 days later, a different vehicle, an older blue sedan, was parked just down the road. The driver's side window was rolled halfway down, and Lydia thought she saw the glint of a camera lens aimed toward the water. When she stepped out onto her porch, the car rolled forward slowly, turning the corner until it vanished from sight. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence, maybe, or people visiting neighbors, but it kept happening. Almost every day that week, a new car would appear, never the same one twice, lingering just long enough to make her skin prickle. Then came the people. A pair of men in windbreakers walked along the shore behind her property. One morning, stopping near the dock, they spoke quietly, pointing at the structure, one of them jotting something down on a clipboard. When Lydia stepped onto the porch, they didn't look up. They turned, walked back the way they came, and disappeared into the trees. That night, she found muddy boot prints on the dock lodge, heavy impressions, the kind that didn't belong to anyone she knew. The footprints led from the shore, across the planks, and ended near the very edge, as if someone had stood there for a long moment before leaving. The sight made her heart pound, not just because someone had been there, but because whoever it was hadn't bothered to hide it. 2 nights later, she woke to the sound of water slapping against wood harder than usual. Pulling back the curtain, in her bedroom, she froze. A dim beam of light was moving across the dock. Someone was out there, hunched over, their flashlight sweeping along the boards. For a moment, she thought they might be fishing, but then she noticed the way they stopped, bent low, and seemed to measure something with a long metal rod. Her breath caught in her throat. She stayed still, not wanting them to know she was watching. After a few minutes, the figure straightened, stepped onto the shore, and disappeared into the dark. By morning, there was another letter in her mailbox. This one was bolder stamped with a red final notice at the top. The language was sharper than before, stating that if she failed to remove or surrender the dock, the HOA would take necessary action to reclaim community assets. No explanation, no evidence, just the same cold finality. She noticed the date on the letter was the same night she'd seen the figure on the dock, as if the visit and the warning were part of the same chain of events. Lydia's home no longer felt like her refuge. She found herself glancing out the window more often, scanning the street for parked cars or slow-moving pedestrians. Even the sound of an engine starting somewhere nearby made her shoulders tense. The peaceful quiet of the lake had been replaced by the constant hum of anxiety, and the view from her kitchen window now carried the same tension as watching a storm roll in over the water. Her neighbors didn't seem to notice anything unusual. If they did, they didn't say. People waved politely as they passed, but there was a distance in their eyes, as if they knew something and didn't want to get involved. Each day brought the same uneasy pattern, unfamiliar faces, silent watchers, and the feeling that the walls of her world were being slowly pressed in. Lydia could sense it building like pressure in the air before a lightning strike, but she still didn't know how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. Knew that sitting and waiting would only tighten the noose the HOA seemed to be weaving around her. If they claimed the dock was on their land, then somewhere, in some file or dusty cabinet, there had to be proof for proof they were wrong. One evening, with a pot of coffee brewing and the final notice lying open on the table like an accusation, she began her search. She pulled out the thick folder of papers she'd kept since buying the property, the deed, the original listing, the old photographs from the day she moved in. Everything she remembered said the dock was hers. Still, a single stack of documents from her file cabinet wasn't enough to fight an organization that clearly had plans. The next morning, she drove to the county recorder's office, a beige building with flickering lights and the smell of old paper. She requested every record related to her address and the lakefront lots around it. The clerk wheeled out two bulky boxes. For hours, Lydia sifted through brittle maps, typewritten contracts, and scanned property surveys. Buried near the bottom of one file was a yellowed map from decades ago. It showed the lake before much of the surrounding land was developed. Her property line extended into the water, clearly marking the dock's location as part of her lot. But in a newer HOA-issued map she found in another file, the outline of her property stopped just short of the dock. The strip of land leading to the water was labeled common space. The change wasn't subtle. It looked deliberate, as if someone had redrawn the boundary to shave off that narrow section. But when she checked county property tax records, she saw she had been paying for that exact stretch of shoreline every year since moving in. The official documents said one thing, the HOA's internal documents another. That meant they were building their case not on truth, but on a version of reality they had quietly created. The more she dug, the more threads she found. Old meeting minutes from the HOA mentioned expansion of public access to waterfront. A proposal was listed to incorporate underutilized docks into shared amenity areas. The notes didn't name her specifically, but the descriptions were precise enough to make her stomach knot. She recognized other spots on the lake where small docks had mysteriously vanished over the years. She also discovered a separate file on a failed development deal from more than 20 years ago. Back then, the HOA had partnered with a private marina company to turn a section of the lake into a paid membership boating area. The project collapsed after disputes over zoning and permits. But tucked inside the file was a clause stating that, if the HOA could acquire unencumbered shoreline access in the future, the marina investors would revisit the deal and pay a hefty bonus for every new dock they could control. It clicked all at once. Her dock wasn't just a personal target. It was a piece of a much larger prize. If they could take it, they could sell access to it, lease it, or package it into the resurrected marina project. And it wasn't just her. Anyone with waterfront property was at risk if their boundaries could be quietly redrawn and backed by the HOA's resources. Lydia left the recorder's office with copies of every suspicious map, meeting note, and development file she could legally take. Her car was heavy with paper, her mind heavier still. The pieces formed an ugly picture: the visits, the photographs, the late-night measuring. They were building a legal trap designed to look official, even though the foundation was nothing but manipulation. As she drove home along the lake road, she passed other docks standing quiet in the afternoon sun. To anyone else, they might have looked safe. To her, they looked like the next marks on a hidden list. She knew now that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be solved with a polite phone call. This was a planned move, years in the making, and her dock was simply in the way of someone else's payday. By midsummer, the tension that had been slowly tightening around Lydia's home snapped into open hostility. The cautious cars and shadowy visitors were gone. In their place came brazen acts that left no doubt about the HOA's intentions. It began with the sound of metal clinking against wood one humid afternoon. When she walked down to the dock, she found a thick chain snaked around the posts, the kind used to secure heavy equipment. It was padlocked tight, a bright yellow tag hanging from it that read in block letters, "Property of HOA." Her first reaction was disbelief. She had not received any notice about this, no warning that someone would come onto her property and physically claim what she owned. She photographed the chain and lock from every angle, then walked the shoreline looking for footprints. There were several steep impressions from boots, the kind worn by contractors or security staff. They led back toward the road, where she noticed fresh tire marks cutting through the damp grass. 2 days later, she came home to find a brand new sign planted at the water's edge. It was professionally printed, dark blue with white letters, and it carried the HOA's emblem. It read, "No trespassing, private access for residents and guests only." The irony was sickening. They had placed a trespassing warning on her own property, turning her dock into a forbidden place for its rightful owner. Then came the attempts at sabotage. Her motion-activated security camera captured footage one night of 2 men in HOA polos approaching the dock. One knelt down and began sawing at the ropes that held her small boat in place. The other stood watch, glancing up toward her house as though checking if she'd noticed. The men eventually left without finishing the job, but the ropes were frayed and weakened, as if the plan had been interrupted. A week later, she heard the knock. It was slow and deliberate, echoing through her hallway like a hammer on hollow wood. When she opened the door, 3 HOA board members stood in a line, each holding a clipboard. Their expressions were flat, their eyes unreadable. Parked behind them was a white pickup truck with an empty trailer hitched to the back. Without saying a word, they stepped past her onto the grass and began walking toward the water. The intrusion was so sudden, so confident, that for a moment she could only stand frozen, watching them. The trailer was clearly meant for the dock. She followed them to the shoreline, her voice sharp as she demanded they leave. They didn't respond, didn't even turn to face her. Instead, one of them knelt to inspect the padlock they had placed days earlier, checking it like a piece of inventory. Another scribbled something on a clipboard. When they finally walked back toward the truck, they glanced at her only once, an expression that wasn't a threat, but something worse. It was the look of people who believed the outcome was already decided. That night, Lydia left every light in her house on. She sat in the living room with the curtains open, her eyes darting to the shoreline every few minutes. Even the sound of the lake against the dock, normally a gentle rhythm that lulled her into calm, now grated on her nerves. She kept her phone on the coffee table, ready to dial the sheriff at the first sign of movement. But deep down, she suspected it wouldn't matter. The HOA's board didn't seem worried about the law. They seemed convinced that whatever they did, no one would stop them. The once peaceful property had become a siege zone. Every creak of the dock boards in the night, every rustle in the trees, felt like the start of another intrusion, and Lydia could tell that whatever they were planning next, it would not be subtle. The slow, creeping phase of their campaign was over. The next move would be decisive. The morning after the knock, Lydia woke to a silence that felt wrong. The usual lapping of water against the dock was missing, replaced by the faint, empty echo of waves hitting bare shore. She stepped outside, the grass still damp with early dew, and froze. The dock was gone. Where the planks should have stretched into the lake, there was only churned mud and jagged impressions where posts had been ripped out. Fresh tire tracks cut deep into the earth, leading from the shoreline up to the road. It looked as though the removal had been done quickly, in the dead of night, with no attempt to hide the damage. Her first instinct was to call the sheriff. When a deputy arrived, clipboard in hand, she explained what had happened. He listened politely, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Then he told her the HOA had provided documentation showing the dock was their property, and without clear proof otherwise, the sheriff's office couldn't treat it as theft. The words landed like a punch. The very people who had taken it were already armed with paperwork to make it appear legitimate. The rest of that day was a blur. Lydia wandered between her kitchen, the empty shoreline, and the living room, unsure what to do next. The space where the dock had stood looked naked, vulnerable, as if part of her home had been amputated. She kept replaying the knock on her door, the truck idling behind the board members, the way they had walked toward the dock without hesitation. This was what they had been building toward all along, and now it had happened exactly as they wanted. That afternoon, she heard the soft clink of her mailbox lid. Inside was a plain manila envelope with no return address. Her name was handwritten across the front. Inside she found a stack of printed photographs. The first image showed the dock intact under moonlight, time-stamped for just after midnight. The next showed two trucks backed up to the shoreline, men in HOA polos, unfastening the chains and loading the planks onto a trailer. One picture captured them hauling the structure away, the tire tracks matching the ones in her yard. Each photograph was clear, sharp, and marked with a date and time, proof that the removal had been done before the official deadline stated in their own notice. Lydia didn't know who had taken the photos, but she knew they were her lifeline. The next morning she took them, along with copies of the county maps and her deed, to the local newspaper office. The editor listened carefully as she laid out the sequence of events, flipping through each piece of evidence. 2 days later, the story appeared on the front page under a bold headline exposing the HOA's actions. It spread quickly, picked up by nearby television stations and shared online, sparking outrage. The investigation that followed uncovered more than just her case. Other homeowners stepped forward, telling similar stories. Structures seized, boundaries altered, and waterfront access taken under the guise of community use. Old meeting notes and emails revealed backroom deals with marina investors, confirming everything Lydia had discovered. Under public pressure, the entire HOA board resigned. Within a month, the county court ruled that the dock had been illegally removed and ordered it returned at the HOA's expense. Weeks later, the dock was rebuilt exactly where it had been, the wood fresh and clean against the glimmering lake, but standing on it again felt different. The sunsets still painted the water gold, but the peace that had once come so easily was gone. She couldn't shake the memory of tire tracks in the mud, the sound of measured knocks at her door, and the knowledge that a group of neighbors had been willing to dismantle her life for profit. The dock was back, but something else had been taken that no court could restore, a trust that would never return.